Salvation Army co-founder Catherine Booth said, "If we are to better the future, we must disturb the present." This is the Disturbance podcast from Salvation Army Women's Ministries. Hi, and welcome to the Disturbance podcast, where we celebrate women making a public disturbance. And we certainly have a disruptive woman with us today. Dr. Natalie Thorburn is a leading expert in gender-based violence, and she leads the policy team at Women's Refuge, which is a national treasure for women in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome to Disturbance, Dr. Natalie.
Kia ora, thank you.
Dr. Thorburn started her life as a registered social worker and did her PhD in violence against women. Since then, she's become a leading voice in gender-based violence. You've probably read her articles in the newspaper or seen her on TV. She has practiced and published a myriad of research in the field, and we're very, very privileged to have you here, a true expert, to help us better understand some of the real issues and as well bust some myths, no doubt. So thank you. Welcome, Natalie. Let's just dive in with like a really fundamental question. What is gender-based violence? What does it look like and what doesn't it look like?
I think to us, gender-based violence is kind of almost all family violence and sexual violence. So most kind of partnership situations that involve violence are gendered. There's not a whole lot of violence in New Zealand that isn't gendered, in fact. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Whether it's gendered, that it's gendered. Largely perpetrated, by men, predominantly against women, but that even when it isn't, it is really about the performance of the role of gender, I suppose. So it's sort of about social power, who has it, who doesn't, who takes it from others. And by and large, the majority of social power still falls to men. And those with the least power are most commonly women.
So, I mean, what makes you say that in, a society we know that more women are going to university and women are equally in the workforce. So why would you say that men still have power and women don't have power as much?
I guess because there's, while we have made leaps forward in terms of women's participation, equal participation in things like the workplace and education, by and large, the assumptions that organise our routine lives still fall in favour of men. So, for instance, the expectations of domestic labour, emotional labour, caregiving, the widespread assumptions about relationships and what behaviour is normal for either a woman or a man in a relationship. Things like jealousy, entitlement, controlling what someone else does, being aggressive, being possessive, all of those things are much more condoned for men than what they are for women.
Interesting. And when you use the word violence, can you define that for us a bit? Like, what is violence?
Sure. I don't think I've ever been asked that before.
Really?
Yeah. So we would define it quite broadly. We tend to obviously, our context is family violence, so we tend to follow the definition in the Family Violence Act, which talks about family violence as including a range of different behaviours, not just physical assault, but all kinds of, behaviour designed to control, oppress, exercise power over another person. So anything from psychological abuse, verbal put downs, controlling what someone does, coercive control, I suppose, and sexual violence, spiritual abuse, stalking, all those sorts of things we count as violence as well. Basically a pattern in which somebody uses power and control over their partner and makes them subordinate in their everyday life.
And so what would the difference between violence in that context be and the sort of, the aggression we all show at sort of the worst times in our relationship, like where we yell at each other or whatever?
Because it does come down to power. So often if there's, all of us behave badly from time to time, right? No one is exempt from that. But having, poor conflict skills or occasionally losing your temper and speaking in a way that you wouldn't want to speak to someone all the time is very different to making someone feel afraid or restricted or oppressed as a matter of course throughout the entirety of your relationship. So it's often something that is ongoing and in which the rules are unequal. So if one person can get away with a lot more than the other and one person doesn't have the same freedom that the other person has, that's when it's often along the lines of gender and power.
And you've said something quite interesting, and that sort of flies in the face of some common beliefs about actually perpetuating violence as a choice.
Always a choice.
And, one of the narratives that we hear the most often is that it's a cycle of violence. So if you were brought up in violence. You're as much a victim as you are a perpetrator.
Yep.
But you say it's a choice. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. Yep. So that is a very, very common narrative. It sort of goes along the lines of hurt people, right?
Yes, that's right.
But if you're victimized yourself, then it's much more likely you'll go on to be a perpetrator. But looking at the distribution of who was harmed through gender-based violence, if that were true, then most of the perpetrators in the world right now would be women.
Right.
And they're not. So that cannot be the only explanation.
As in, so women are the ones that are greatest harmed.
And girls. So even as children, girls are disproportionately likely to suffer from violence by a family member, by anyone else, to suffer sexual abuse, to suffer the impacts of aggression. But by and large, they do not grow up to become perpetrators. So that cannot be the defining explanation. We also know that most people who are harmed by family violence as children do not go on to perpetrate violence.
Right.
So it is not necessarily a foregone conclusion by any stretch. And I guess the other aspect of that is that it's who you decide to hurt. That is the telling factor. So no matter what you've been exposed to, as you go about your everyday life, men do not tend to take out their aggression on their colleagues or on their friends or on their rugby coach or on random people on the street. They wait until they come home and they use violence specifically against their partner, usually when no one else can see it. And I guess the other thing for that is that it sort of assumes when we say hurt people, that there's a level of uncontrolled normalizing of violence. But most of the violence that we see, where even when there is physical violence, the majority of the violent tactics that are used are invisible. They're not ones that are impulsive. They're not ones that are on the spur of the moment when you lose control. It's things like monitoring someone's use of their phone and controlling who they see, when they see them, what they talk about, their relationships with their friends and family. It's controlling the use of money. And none of those things are about a loss of control.
So if it's not about this sort of idea of like just not being able to manage your anger well, and therefore seeing it as an impulsive thing, what is it about? What causes gender-based violence?
In New Zealand specifically? Yep. So we always say there are two kind of stories of origin. The first is colonization, because pre-colonial times, that was not the norm at all by any stretch. That there was a very egalitarian kind of approach to community life, and it was considered a trespass against kind of mana, whakapapa, etc., to harm a woman in your family. And the second is patriarchy or gender inequality, which was almost a byproduct of colonization in New Zealand, really. That's something we brought in with us. And that determines, I guess, what behaviour is considered normative, condoned, the expectations of men, the expectations of women, and therefore the, I guess, social legitimizing of who has the right to use violence against their partner and children.
That's a huge, you've put it very succinctly, but that's actually a huge answer. So we're unpacking two massive cultural worldviews that are still in place in New Zealand. So colonization and gender inequity. So can you just unpack it a bit further for us? First of all, I guess my first question is like, okay, colonization. Well, it's not just, Māori that are violent.
No. In fact, the majority of homicides in New Zealand are perpetrated by white men.
Right.
Colonization is, like when we name that as one of the driving kind of factors in influencing who uses violence, we definitely do not use it as a finger pointing at Māori, but more an explanation for why wahine Māori are more commonly harmed than Pākehā women. And that is because it eroded the protective structures, that enabled, that gave women safety, and that upheld, I guess, the sacredness of their roles and their participation and their equal worth and the worth of their generations to come. It also, I guess, took away a lot of the resources and the rights that they had to organise their lives in the collective way that gave rise to such protective structures. And with it, took away a lot of the, I guess, innate power that they held socially and as kind of within the kinship ties, and made them much more able to be harmed. And but that's not to say necessarily that Māori are causing the harm. By and large, that is not necessarily the case at all. And So it takes away even now, the intergenerational impacts of colonization in terms of that dispossession, displacement, the taking of resources, the stealing of land, the connections to, to whenua and whakapapa are so undermined that when somebody is harming wahine Māori, they have much fewer options and resources to pull from to have alternatives to that relationship.
Gender inequity in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would think there is no gender inequity.
Yep.
So can you unpack that a little bit more as well?
I'm sure a lot of people in New Zealand think that we have long since achieved gender equality. We know that that's still not the case. I mean, there are many indicators still of that. And we still see that women's participation in every part of life, while they may now have more access to those things, I guess there's a difference between the rate of access and the outcomes associated with it. That by and large, women are still tasked with having the majority of caregiving burden responsibility. That obviously we've yet to achieve pay equity, and we certainly have not achieved equity in terms of safety and freedom. So a woman's right to move freely, to participate in everything without fear that she will be harmed, those things are very far from equal still. And we still see that unconscious bias, the assumptions of women as needing to have a higher standard of morality, of behaviour, their expectations of how well we perform our roles in every part of our lives is still vastly different. We see that, for instance, in the family court, where if you look at, I guess, judges' perceptions of parents, where there's, and by most of the cases going to family court involve family violence, despite that, if we look at the expectations of men's behaviour as fathers, it very much occasionally interacts with children, does not actively undermine their safety most of the time. If we look at the expectations of women, it is to take care of absolutely every part of their educational, physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological well-being, to cater for them and be selfless for them in every single part of what they do. And that if there is a risk to the children brought about by men's violence, it is still often women that are held accountable for that in court, not men.
Yeah.
So, the discrepancies, I think, if we see an image, for example, of a woman holding a cell phone and feeding their children takeaways, our view is very negative. If we see the photo of a man doing the same thing with her children, we say, look what an engaged father he is. So that unconscious bias and, kind of, I guess, very disproportionate expectation of parental responsibility is still really, really far apart.
Absolutely, yeah. You make such good points there about those innate perceptions that we actually all have taken on, and therefore it's quite hard to see them. We've internalized them all. Like sometimes I use the example when I'm speaking of like when we have a little girl, and she's really into trucks. And you often will hear a parent being like, oh, yeah, my girl doesn't play with dolls. She's really into trucks. And that we're really proud of that. But you don't really hear the same thing of a little boy who wants a pink sparkly dress. Yes. That's something
the departure from the gender stereotype.
Yeah, that's something that's a cause of anxiety for parents. And if we're okay with it, then we're progressive, but we're definitely not celebrating it.
Yeah.
So, and
what's the teach from a very young age about how it is okay to be, to be vulnerable. If we see boys playing with dolls, for example, often the same condemning social response. And yet what we're effectively discouraging is a show of boys as nurturing parents.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we often don't treat gendered violence as a crime when it's by someone known. So we have almost two categories of crime implicitly in New Zealand, those perpetrated by strangers and those perpetrated by men in your family. And the punishments, the penalties, the intervention for those are vastly different.
So you're talking about it at court, at a legal system level?
Yes, social responses too, though, workplace responses too, family responses, community responses, as well as police and justice. That if you say, this random man is stalking me, he broke in through my window and he assaulted me, and now he's following my every movement and telling me what I can and can't do, that tends to be taken very, very seriously. If you say the same thing about your partner, then by and large the feedback is you should get away from him. Why haven't you made him stop?
Yes, exactly.
It's not seen as criminal.
Exactly. Like often when we're spotlighting gender-based violence, and we actually are wanting to do the right thing, but we can keep the spotlight on women and say, why is it so hard for women to get out of relationship? But why can't they get out of an abusive relationship? We're somehow still like victim shaming.
It is very victim blaming, because it sort of assumes that the reason that you're in this situation is because of your choices, not because of the person committing the crime, which is not something we apply to any other category of crime.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, I want to ask you the question: why is it so hard for women to get out of out of violent relationships?
I guess because like the act of leaving. I mean, if we think about leaving any relationship, it's hard, right? There are a lot of things that you have to do to make that work. There's a lot of life admin, a lot of organizing burden, physical work required, negotiation of difficult emotional things to get out. If you imagine doing that against a backdrop in which you're afraid of your partner all the time, or he's disabled or sabotaged most of your options outside of that relationship all the time, and by leaving, you know that he will have set into effect, you know, a chain reaction of things that will further sabotage your life. Is that still a viable option? And then if we think about what happens...
sorry to interrupt, but can you give me an example?
Sure, yeah. So if we think about a relationship in which a man is using violence against a woman, the likelihood of her having equal access to household income is very low. And the likelihood of her having maintained all of her close relationships is very low because he will have actively sabotaged those, discouraged those, gotten in the way of them. And that can happen through really subtle things like relentlessly accusing her of cheating every time she has a conversation with any man that she knows, or saying that she's choosing her friends over him if ever she engages with them separately to him, or that she must have something to hide if he's not involved in every conversation, and then making that unpleasant enough that she just gradually disengages over time. It might be things like if she's a parent, the likelihood of him having shared care or full care of their children if they separate, not often a risk that mothers want to take. The likelihood of him having damaged her reputation, you know, spreading rumors about her sexual history, her mental health, making people believe that she's crazy, all of that kind of thing that then sets it up for her to have really bad life prospects after the relationship. And that's no longer starts to seem like such a viable choice. We also often think about the fact that if you leave, that is the time you're most likely to be hurt or killed. So you might be able to make the decision to end a relationship, but you never get to make the decision to end the violence. Only the perpetrator does. So that could go on for years. It could get much more risky. And in the meantime, you've sacrificed a whole lot of the things that set up your life and make you manage that. So we always come back to the kind of simple fact that leaving a violent relationship isn't about making good choices. It's about having really good options. And a lot of those options are undermined by the violence itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like what you're saying about, you know, he's set a trap for you almost, so that if you leave, he's going to accuse you of mental health issues. That's then going to make it harder for you to gain custody of your children. And your biggest fear is probably that he's going to, you know, that he's going to take the children. And so you're constantly asking yourself, what's safer for me to leave or stay?
But it's always a trade-off. And sometimes it's safer to stay. And I mean, we see some really compelling examples of that. For instance, like, you know, the abusive partner feeling like she was going to leave at some point, so repeatedly called police and said, I'm really worried about her. I think she's going a bit crazy. I think she has some mental health issues. She seems a bit paranoid. I'm worried she might hurt herself or the children. What do I do? And so this massive record or portrayal of this woman had been set up without her ever having had any mental health issues or diagnosis or treatment. So that when she called for the police for the first time and said that he'd strangled her, they said, have you spoken to your mental health team today? No justice response, no attendance at that. And he had just effectively sabotaged her only access to formal safety. And we see that a lot, and especially because it is so crazy making, it is so full on to have to manage. You find yourself doing counterintuitive things day to day just to cope with all of that. That then if it does turn into a court battle or even just a battle of, you know, public opinion in terms of your friends and family, you're going to look bad.
Absolutely.
So the odds are so far stacked against you as a woman in that situation that it's really hard to find any viable option to leave.
That's very sobering to sort of hear a concrete example of how easily that can be, the system can be manipulated. And weaponized. And then you think even about the close relationships thing, like if you're going to have to risk having violence against you every time you try and make a phone call to someone, you're eventually going to give up that fight to maintain that relationship.
Meanwhile, he's telling your friends things or making sure that it gets back to them. So their perception of you is that you have gone off the rails at that point. It's very effective.
I really see what you're saying about it being a very deliberate
campaign almost.
And but I'm still struggling to see how a man can treat a woman like that?
It's honestly amazing, the consistency amongst those patterns of violence, the very deliberate, purposeful decisions that are intricate. They're intricately webs that are woven over decades sometimes, but often years, as though everyone has read the same manual on how to do that, on how to effectively entrap women in a relationship. Yeah.
And where does that come from, do you think?
I think that does in part come from the socialization of how we perceive gender. Because, we've certainly all at times caught ourselves buying into some of that and had to really question our own beliefs or assumptions about why we automatically consider her actions to be subpar while giving him excuses. And that's just so prolific that unless you're actually consciously doing that all the time, we tend to buy into the status quo without questioning it too deeply. Yeah.
And when do men get this seemingly innate knowledge of how to manipulate? And
I don't know. I don't know whether that's just, again, what you see ends up being what you do, or whether that's sort of a very opportunistic using what power that you have, because to the extent that you'll get away with it and it works, so you keep doing it. We talk about it as being experimental, that you try this one thing, it has a desired effect in terms of putting her on the back foot or making her more kind of accountable to you or more answerable to your needs, so you keep doing it. You try something different and it extends that even further, so you keep doing that. It's very sort of tailored around your particular circumstances. Yeah.
And I did read a survey, a very large survey that was done, and it's from the States, but it was a man that works consistently with men in prison for violence against women. And so he does a lot of work and asked, why do you do it? And their answer was always so I can get what I want.
Yeah.
It's it was very...
It doesn't come down to because I lost my temper at the time.
No.
I felt out of control. It comes down to because I could. And because it would get me what I wanted.
Yeah. So it's, if you do this, then you'll get your way, basically.
Yes.
So it's as simple as that. And yet it's not simple at all, it's...
Certainly not for its victims.
Horrific, yeah. The other thing I want to ask you about when it comes to these gender norms and gender dynamics is something that I think has come up a bit more since the, dare I say it, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, is this myth of the perfect victim. And how we often don't perceive women as victim if they also show aggression in a relationship.
Yes.
So can you explain that to me a bit more?
I think, first of all, as women, if we look at our pasts, there is not a single one of us that is absolutely blameless for the entirety of our lives. That all of us have some sort of shameful behavior. There are all times that we've done things that we're not proud of. But as soon as we become a victim of violence, that is all up for grabs in terms of discrediting our stories. And yet, it doesn't matter if you're the most, manipulative, drug-using, selfish person out there, you can still be a victim of violence and that not be your fault. Those things are not related. That no amount of bad behavior on your part invites violence to be used against you. And likewise, even if you were absolutely blameless, that does not mean violence would not be used against you. So there's a real kind of, I guess, the disjuncture there when we're looking, again, turning the kind of deep lens on the woman to try and find out what she did that caused it, or how she's somehow culpable, or why she must be the guilty party, and trying to find any excuse possible to exonerate the person who she's accused of using violence. And that one was really, because there was so much damning evidence in terms of what was done to her, that was so much subordinated in favour of what she was accused of having done to him, which was still remarkably, insignificant in comparison. But also that speaks to the fact that I'm like, if someone is constantly oppressing you, degrading you, making you feel lesser, your responses are not going to be measured. They're not going to be perfect and kind. You're not going to be thinking there's a camera on you and you're building, a kind of picture of yourself as blameless. You're going to respond in a way that best protects your sense of self. And women we always say that for every act of violence, there's an act of resistance. Women do not take this lying down. They don't have as much power, so they cannot cause, as much harm, and they cannot keep themselves safe from someone's violence entirely. But they can resist it, and they do in subtle ways all the time. And it's those subtle ways that people often look at as though they're standalone behaviors that would have happened anyway, but they're not. They're only ever in response to someone else harming them. When they do the most that they can to protect themselves, their dignity, their sense of self. And
I think about relationships in which the woman yells back. And so there's yelling in the house, and the narrative is like, well, it takes kind of two to tango. They were both...
She was giving as good as she gets. There's family violence between them, something we still see really frequently in police reports even.
Right.
We're like, between you, but it's not. It's never really one-sided. It's never really mutual. It's always sort of one-sided in terms of who is precipitating that dynamic and who has the most power to cause harm within it. Because often and like we see this all the time, where if he strangles her for 3 hours before she manages to call police show up, it's finally safe for her to resist, so she slaps him across the face. But that's the only piece of the pie that is visible, is her slapping him across the face.
But she's finally
safe to resist, and you don't take that lying down, because how undignified, right? Who would just give up all of their power and dignity and just accept that? Of course you don't. You fight back in whatever way you can, but that way is really limited because you have so much less power. But it is often the more visible, so we tend to sort of blame the responses to that behavior more than we look at what behavior is sitting underneath it. And I guess as well, because men underestimate their culpability, women always overestimate theirs. So women will often say, oh yeah, we're both as bad as each other. And then we look into it and we're like, actually, the fact that, you hit him on the hand that one time because he'd already hurt his hand punching the wall repeatedly, and it was finally safe for you to resist that way. But the rest of the time was him holding you down and strangling you until you lost consciousness. That's not equal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who started the physical aggression, and it's never you. So there's a real kind of disjuncture there in terms of, how men perceive their own behavior and how women perceive theirs, because they always assume that they had done something to cause it.
And if you kind of just take that moment to step into somebody else's situation and think, how would I react if someone attacked me physically? Yeah. Well, I'd be ashamed of myself if I just laid there and took it. Exactly. Of course you're going to fight back. But then that becomes weaponized against you, as part of the narrative that, they were both as bad as each other.
Yes. Yeah. Without looking at, but whose purpose was being served here by that violence.
Right.
The only other part of that is that if you know that you won't be believed, if you know that he will probably not face consequences, and I default to he, even though of course it can be anyone in any relationship, but it's most commonly, and particularly the worst of the violence, is most commonly perpetrated by men. But if you know that even after a severe assault, he's going to be back and free to continue to harm you, that actually doesn't seem that safe as an option. And so we can't really blame women for not taking that option when they know that it is likely to cause more harm than good sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you don't see a viable way to live separately from him and have him not harm you, what's the point of leaving?
Yeah. And I guess this is really where Women's Refuge comes in at the front line.
Yeah.
Who is it that you see coming into Refuge? What level are they at?
That is anywhere on the spectrum. What we do, and I mean, because not all violence is necessarily lethal, right? Like not everyone wants to go into a safe house to get away from it, and that's great. Like we would like to see women much earlier. And so, 90% of women we work with in the community, they don't need to go into safe houses. For those that do, that's at the very, very critical point where we know that there is a risk that they might be killed. But even before that, I'm like, women come to Refuge when everything they can do to manage that risk themselves no longer works. And so they're at the highest risk they've ever been at. And for some, that's threatening in many ways that aren't necessarily always just physical. For others, that's still extremely high risk in terms of the physical and the likely severity or lethality associated with that. So kind of everyone on the spectrum, but at the point where everything they can do themselves isn't enough anymore.
So what is it that women are doing to manage risk?
Everything. For every kind of tactic that their partners use, there's some kind of way that they use, and that might look on the face of it counterintuitive. Right. It might look like them being reckless, destructive, them mutually engaging, but actually we find that it's incredibly sophisticated. Like if there's a function where she can't afford to go in with a black eye, she might prompt a fight a week earlier because she knows that then he'll hit her then, and the bruises will be gone by the time she needs to appear fine. We see that, if they're monitoring their partners, the women's cell phones, for example, that there's a lot of sophisticated mechanisms that they use so that they can still engage in some kind of digital activity without that being spotted. Things like, if they're coming home from work and they've stayed late to talk to a friend, that they will give their friend cash and get their friend to book the Uber on their phone. Really little things that happen all day, every day. Wow. But imagine the amount of mental capacity that takes up and what that doesn't leave for other things.
I was going to say, imagine. And that's another point that I think I've read in your writing before that we don't take into account. Yeah. The ongoing effect of violence is not just like you escape violence and then, oh, good, you're back on track. Yeah. Because you've actually had years and years years in which your ability to earn money has been eroded.
Your life prospects, your material resources, your mental capacity, your emotional kind of well-being, that all of that is threatened and threatened and threatened. And even if by some miracle the perpetrator leaves the country and never talks to you again, the risks, because of the harm you've already suffered, proliferate. They take on a life of their own well beyond the duration of the relationship, which is amazing given that for most perpetrators, there's never one victim. There's many. And so one perpetrator can cause a lot of damage to a lot of women's and a lot of children's lives over their lifetime.
I mean, we're not even talking about the children today, but of course children never escape family harm.
No.
Yeah.
Especially not when they're condemned to then spend, week on, week off alone with the perpetrator. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No matter how at risk they feel.
It is actually scary.
Yeah.
To think about that.
It is. Yeah.
And also so you were sort of making the point that, if the perpetrator leaves the country, well, that never happens for a start. So that's, it's sort of like
they die of natural causes and suddenly there's freedom.
So that's, but, she's had a lifetime of not being able to maybe achieve the education that she would have liked to, therefore.
Having to change jobs, things
build
like
a career.
Him sabotaging the car every morning when she's due to leave for work. So then she's entirely dependent on him running out debt in her name, breaking up the house so she can't get a new tenancy lease. Those things, the social precarity that brings about will sustain well beyond, the relationship does.
Yeah, there has a lifetime knock-on effect of what she can earn in a lifetime and
how well she's able to be, which is why, we end up finding that family violence is the single biggest contributor to disease burden for women of reproductive age. So more so than obesity or smoking.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
because
can you
the health
explain
risk
that need?
of that. Yeah. So kind of the if we look at the contributors to ill health, for women of reproductive age, that's the biggest one. It carries the biggest risks on all physical symptoms. Yeah. Amazing, right?
Family violence.
But we don't have the public health campaign equivalent of stop smoking or don't drink drive or healthy eating. We don't have that for family violence.
Yes, well, the sort of thrust of this 16 days of activism that we're focused on at the moment in the Salvation Army, the theme for this year is fund. Fund women's welfare programs, because I'll just look at my notes for this, because it says, the sort of alarming statistic that the UN Women put out is that only 1% of gender-based funds go to women's organisations, who we know are the most effective in empowering women. So there's almost this complete and utter
disregard for women.
Yes.
Like all other women's issues. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet we also see that, as much as it's so important for women who have already been harmed to have the means to A, be safe from further violence, and B, restore some of the kind of, the rights, the freedom, the material resources, the stability, the well-being that has been taken over that time. We also know that by intervening with women, we do not solve the problem of men's violence. We just change who the victim is. And that's not enough. So the only way that we can actually stop men from just finding a different partner or, continuing to abuse both prior and future partner is by intervening with men. And that needs to be a kind of three-pronged approach, right? As the women's services that are comprehensive, that focus on restoring what is lost, as well as safety. The intervention with men that anyone can refer to, that men hold each other to account, etc., in this very kind of accountability, behaviour change based. And 3, the kind of state responses to family violence that treat it as a crime and condemn it, and encourage communities to do the same. Yeah. So
what do we need to do? I'm taking from this conversation that we can't put the burden on women and say, this is your individual kind of responsibility to leave this.
And hold him accountable where the state has failed to do so, but you alone should be able to stop him from using violence. Yeah.
So it needs a systemic state level response. What should that response be?
A role from every single person.
Right.
Because every person in every role has that. All of us are, all of us know men, where we have either male partners, or we have brothers, or we have fathers, or we have friends who are men. It would be highly unusual to find someone who didn't. And so if, the men that we know are stepping up and discouraging that with each other, that has a more powerful social response in terms of reducing men's violence than what any accountability measure in the justice system can do. But they don't tend to do it. And we see that play out particularly in the workplace. We look at how New Zealand's progressed. And again, we've kind of front runners in workplace provisions for family violence, but we focus on it as though it's a natural disaster that just happens to women. part of the natural climate with no perpetrator attached. It just happens to women. And we don't have the equivalent around how do workplaces actually think about the fact that for every victim that you might come across in the workplace, there's a perpetrator who's also in the workplace that someone is likely to be working with, who is perpetrating violence on work time, using work resources, using the kind of legitimation of their role to do that. And then we find that when, like, despite workplaces really, really stepping up and being like, we want to support women, we want to support victims, we want to make sure that's not losing their place in the workplace, we would never condone family violence. And yet when a man comes to them and say, I've been accused of this, more often than not, they're the ones going to court and supporting the man and championing him and saying what a good person he is, not condemning that behavior. And there's no punitive response. There's no workplace condemnation of that. Yeah, because he doesn't look like the monster that we believe in our minds he must look like if he was a perpetrator.
That's right. So what do perpetrators look like?
Every single one of us. Yeah. Yeah. They look like our brothers and our fathers. There is no differentiating feature. Someone can be nice and kind and responsible and very effective in their job and still be a perpetrator at home.
Why do we find it so hard to believe that this man we know is a perpetrator?
An illustrious history of disbelieving women.
Right. Yeah.
Amber Heard is a perfect example of this. And the consequences for women speaking up.
We are not.
And widespread disbelief. We're not as evolved as we think we are.
Exactly. Yeah. We always say believe women, believe women.
Until it's a man that we know, and then we don't. Yeah.
Yeah, because we think, how could that happen?
No, I know him. He wouldn't.
What a nice guy. Yeah. And that's very dangerous. Yeah. That's very dangerous because part of the whole manipulative character is, I think, like you said at the very beginning, it's a choice.
Yes.
They're nice to their colleagues at work. They're the best colleagues, and
the consequences of violence mean that after a while, no one will have seen him acting crazy. But they're likely to have seen the partner acting crazy because it's crazy making stuff. It's not rational. It does make you feel like you're losing your mind. The things you have to do in response to it don't look rational. But on the face of it, he looks very rational. That is normally the way that it goes. So in terms of the credibility fight, men will usually win that. Yeah.
Wow, that's so disturbing and deep, and a lot to think about there. So what do we need to do? What at an organisational level do we need to be doing better?
I guess for everyone to collectively and through discussion, become more informed about the gendered dynamics of family violence. And the gendered dynamics are the ones that often get lost in public discourse because increasingly we see that watered down, to family violence, to family harm, even where neither gender or violence are actually named as part of that. And we can do that as individual organizations. We can do it in our peer groups. We can do it in our homes until, we actually have some traction around what we're collectively not prepared to tolerate. And then on a state level as well, like at the moment, a lot of the things that disadvantage women's options are still kind of manifest at systemic levels. So looking at, even things like the viability of women living separately to perpetrators and having the means to do so. Like if we think about, for instance, the outdated mechanisms like benefit law, for example, the condition on that for accessing a benefit that still says you're disqualified from accessing that if you're in a relationship in the nature of marriage, which is taken to mean living together or approximate to. And yet, now living together is not necessarily approximate to marriage. And that if you're living with someone because he's decided that he wants you to live with him, you have 3 children, the likelihood of an abuser stepping up and, actually funding those 3 children's lives is pretty low. But then if you continue to access the only means available for you to provide for your children in that situation, he has an immediate weapon. The second that you do anything wrong, he can threaten to report you and you lose your weekly income. And that's incredibly powerful. So there are a lot of steps that we can take just in terms of those structural things that give women better options and stop them from being able to be tied so easily to someone who absolutely knows that the odds are stacked against them and can weaponize that. And then I guess there's how we treat it as a crime, because if we did have that swift, strong, protective response that did treat it as though it was on par with a stranger attack, for instance. I mean, at the moment we have, a man can severely assault a woman and get a lesser sentence than someone who assaulted an empty police car. One of the most recent examples that we noticed, that really struck us. So often, they're far too soon. They are back in the community with no accountability measure. And the woman is saying, I'm afraid he's going to kill me. I'm afraid he's going to kill me. Please don't let him out. He's going to kill me. And a few months later, that's exactly what happens. And everyone says, if only we could have seen this coming. And we're like, everybody saw this coming. There was no other outcome. So until we actually take women's fear seriously and act on that, we're not going to be able to change that. And then the other thing is with children. Like if we condemn children to have to see perpetrators that they are afraid of, which is what we're doing at the moment, we cannot change that. I mean, the social precarity that brings about for them, the burden of, in terms of health, well-being, but also the internalization of hopelessness that the system cannot and will not protect you. This is just a reality. Men hurt women and children. You cannot be safe from it, and adults won't protect you. We cannot really change the future for those statistics either. We have to show children that we're prepared to listen to when they're afraid and act on that information to make them safer.
So does that sort of work itself out in the family court?
Yes, where there's still a presumption that both parents have an equal right to the child, and that if the father still wants to see their children, therefore, look, they're trying to be a good dad. Oh, sure, they behave violently towards mum, but they're really a good dad. And yet undermining every aspect of your children's well-being by using violence against them and their mother is not good parenting. And it's not safe parenting. And so at the moment, we are kind of contradicting our own legislation. We're not treating the children's interests as paramount.
That's right, yeah. But it's interesting because, you know, sort of parallel to this conversation, there's that conversation about men wanting to be more involved fathers and the burden of men having,
and if they're safe
children,
absolutely,
having children taken away from them. So,
but which then yet most cases going to family court have family violence histories. So I'm like, by and large, if men have an interest in parenting and they've been safe even for just a period of time, they will get shared care. Like it's actually more in their favour than it is for women. And more often than not, they do that against children's wishes, because children's safe person is usually their mother. That is their protective parent. The perpetrating parent should not have a presumptive right of access until they've been proven safe. And at the moment, we're not applying that.
Because we are a community organisation, and
people must be good people.
They are good people, but one of the things I think that we would say is that we are looking at our community ministries and we're saying there's a problem with violence in the community, and we are working with people who are coming into emergency housing, and a lot of them have had domestic violence, and we need to work on that. And then by default, because we've forgotten that we also have a whole workforce, we kind of make a unspoken presumption that what's not happening in the workforce. Because we hire good people who don't have those problems. Is sort of there. And then when we look at those assumptions about who has those problems, then we start to find not a lot of that holds true at the end, right? That actually all of us are vulnerable to that, and all of us know people who will be perpetrating that. Because it is too prolific not to be. That's right. And like you've said, it doesn't look like what we imagine in our head, the woman turning up with a black eye.
And it's often not as visible. So I'm like, what we obviously, family violence doesn't discriminate based on class. It doesn't discriminate based on income or privilege, but how it looks does. So although violence will traverse every social group in society, those who have the least will be most visibly harmed. So that's more about whether or not, you're in a community where it's more normal to beat your partner in front of other people and leave them with black eye, or whether it's more subtle, insidious, and I guess invisible to everybody else, which you tend to see at the kind of other end of the class spectrum. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening. It just means it's more subtle, and that there are unlikely to be as many visible signs of it prior to it becoming extremely bad.
Which I think, again, shows that about the choice that you said, because if men are actually perpetuating in such a way that it's not visible, then it's not just about loss of control. It's very controlled.
And most violence is not impulsive.
Which is quite shocking, actually. It's quite confronting once again in a different way to confront our previous explanation, which has been that, these just guys don't know how to manage their anger.
And yet 80% of our clients are digitally stalked, and 10% are forced to become pregnant or enter pregnancy when they don't want to. And those things are never impulsive.
No.
They take a lot of pre-planning and a lot of subtle setting up the groundwork for that.
Absolutely. So tell me about the like gender-based violence in the age of the digital world.
So I think there's a real tendency to look at the abuse that happens using technology as like a different kind of violence. Like, this didn't happen before, but now that we have all of the fancy technology,
it's not in real life.
It's not in real life, therefore it's lesser, it's not a problem, etc. Or it's this distinct type that young people, but who are naive and risky about technology, are susceptible to. But that's not true at all. It really is. It's the same pattern, it's the same intention, it's the same power dynamics playing out through a different forum. And they're never really, well, for us anyway, they're hardly ever distinct from real life either. So I'm like, you're kind of, the digital, I guess, self operates as an extension of your physical self. all of us use digital technology. We all use it every day, which makes it, very, very convenient for an abuser to capitalize on and make that part of the abuse, right? Because it means that just because you have a phone, you can contact people, doesn't mean you're allowed to. And it doesn't mean that it won't be spotted. And it has functioned to make abuse more expedient for the perpetrator, and that if you capture everything that someone's doing all day over the phone, you don't have to sit there and watch them all day.
Again, that speaks into the manipulative nature of it, right?
And a very purposeful campaign of intimidation, threat, power over. Not a sudden, I've had too many beers on a Friday night and lost my temper kind of narrative.
I want to finish on a slightly positive note. There's not a lot happy to talk about when we talk about violence.
There is women's resistance to it. There's the way that women step up for other women. There's the way that women have incredible interactions with, their workplaces or police or their friends and family who end up being heroic, and what options they're able to have.
Yeah. So tell me how women can help women, since this is a women's podcast.
Well, we can believe them.
Yeah.
I know that sounds really basic, but it never hurts to go back to basics, because often they do get lost and forgotten. And we can not judge their choices, because often, this stuff is so subtle, insidious, and crazy making. Trying to articulate it to someone in the heat of the moment is really, really hard. There's no way that someone's going to be able to communicate every piece of that puzzle through a series of conversations. So often we just have to accept at face value that if a woman is making this choice, if they feel unable to do what we think is the obvious option, there's a very good reason for it. We just haven't, we haven't understood enough of the picture yet to understand that. So if we start with the assumption that whatever they're choosing is the safest for them at that time, that's a really, really great start. And then ask them what they need. And it's literally that simple. If we ask women what they need and then we do that's normally the kind of magic fix.
Wow.
As much as that's possible. Yeah.
So women do know what they need. They just can't access it.
Yes. Yeah. Or it's simply not possible, and sometimes it's not. But most of the time, there are always things that we can do to help if we ask the right questions about what do you need right now? What can I do? What would be the most helpful thing for you?
So I was quite inspired by talking to one of our community ministries in core in Waitakere, and they have as part of their work with women in violence, is women who have been able to leave the relationship, giving them phones.
Yeah.
So it's as simple as that. It's giving them a tool which has been denied them in their previous relationship.
We can also offer them childcare, take the kids for a while.
Yeah.
Very, very helpful. Give them somewhere to stay, give them money, because often that's one of the hardest things that you cannot do very much without access to that. Being the one that they can call, checking in on them if we've set that up with them in advance. And again, women resist in so many ways that we had one person who knew that if she sent like a cat gift to her sister would call, and she would have to have it on speaker. She wasn't allowed to have private conversations. So every conversation she had to be on speaker so he could listen to. But she would time that at a time that she knew that he was about to escalate his aggression. And so with her sister there on speaker as witness, he had to back down. He could not be as aggressive without her, instigating a police process. And at some point that got to the point where she knew that if she sent that, she would know that it was an emergency. If she didn't pick up her phone, she would dispatch police. And so that sort of safety mechanism that did not evoke any suspicion, it didn't risk making things worse, because often it is a risk if we try to help without actually listening to what's going on. But acted as a really, really vital safeguard for the times that she needed it most. Yeah.
Wow. That just, I think that's a glimpse into the really hard work that it is.
The intense effort.
To
survive something like that.
Exactly. So I wanted to just talk about what safety looks like. So let's think about what could be. What would safety look like for women?
I think one of the first things would be, in my perfect utopia of women's safety, that if a woman calls police, or anyone really, and says that her partner is hurting her, that there's a systems response that involves her not having to do any of the work involved in getting to safety. As in that the state then steps in, we all kind of rally, and we do the accountability safety measures. He cannot get to her under any circumstances without her having to do that all herself, and ultimately still holding the risk at the end of the day when the other things don't work. So that is all she should have to do, is pick up the phone and make that call. And then everything else should be taken on by everyone else, not by her. That to me is what safety looks like.
Absolutely. And even like thinking further out than that, something that we all as women take for granted, just so for granted, is, for example, we put safety mechanisms in place if we're walking somewhere
Yes.
at night.
We hold our keys. Yes. Yeah.
We don't even consider, and we all do this, and then
the unconscious workload that we all do around risk assessment, basically, right? Assessing the risk of anything that we're doing because of the risk of violence.
And I think sometimes it can be a shock to men when they realise that women are very busy doing that.
They don't have to think about that.
Yeah.
I think safety is only truly achievable when men take that burden upon themselves in terms of changing the culture of violence against women instead of waiting for women to do it.
Yeah. So let's talk about what men can do.
Yeah, a whole lot more that they can be doing in everyday conversations that disallow the subtle kind of demeaning of women, the condoning of kind of, violent talk, sexist talk, misogynistic kind of messaging that they can do on an everyday basis with every person they're interacting with. They have a powerful role to play there that apparently most of them aren't really doing. So that's sort of where I'd start with men, is the fact that if someone is behaving in harmful ways towards women, that is on them to call out. They have a social responsibility to do that.
And feel the discomfort, feel the discomfort of breaking the bro code.
Yeah, the taboo of gendered expectation.
To speak up. And
and feel secure in themselves after doing it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The other thing that I would say about safety is that we will not achieve any kind of change in those rates of violence until we start taking care of women and children together, because the only real way for children to recover from family violence, to build, safe, wonderful lives beyond that, is to be kept safe and together with their protective parent, which is their mum. So if we're separating them, if we're not supporting their mum, with everything she needs after having gone through so much to be able to parent, with the capacity and the resources to do that, or if we're, not listening to children when they say they're afraid of the perpetrator, and we're separating those two things as though they're different, we can't really achieve that change. So it's not really until we think about children's safety as being contingent on the safety of their mothers that we can really see a change in those statistics going forward.
We haven't really focused on women's refuge so much because we've been talking about the bigger issues. How have you seen, what have you found the most effective to change women's lives?
I think it comes down to advocacy, because I think that's something that's probably distinct for the refuge movement, that you can access other services, but most of them don't really reflect Women's Refuge's way of doing advocacy, which is to literally stand alongside women, to fight for them and with them, to take everything that they say seriously, to take the violence against them seriously, understand it, act with them and on their behalf, to make the system work better, and to give them back some of what has been so kind of brutally taken from them through no fault of their own. And so that it can be massively open-ended, that could be months and months of engagement. It could just be kind of a week of emergency help when she needs it. But it's never really just about a place to go, or, a woman learning more about family violence, because let's face it, they know it all already. And we don't need to teach that. But really just, it's the solidarity of it. It's the, when you come in, we've got you, we will walk with you and get you what you need.
Dr. Natalie Thorburn, this has just been like such an illuminating conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about what violence is, the causes, some of the fundamental issues, what we need to do as society, what we need to do as individuals. I think it's just been absolutely fantastic. So I just want to thank you so much for gifting us your expertise, and for dedicating your life to learning about this. And thank you for the work of Women's Refuge. I mean, fundamentally, thank you seems like a small word, but thank you for the work.
Thank you for putting a spotlight on it.